To put the kind of set the stage for the discussion today, let me just say the following. As you all remember, on December 6, 2017, President Trump issued a statement recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and directed the U.S. Department of State to begin preparation to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. A decision followed soon afterwards to move the embassy to Jerusalem on May 14 to coincide with the commemoration of Israel's 70th Independence Day. And the rumor is that the president or the vice president might participate in that event. Mr. Trump, of course, as you all remember, based his decision on the 1995 Jerusalem Embassy Act that was passed by Congress at the time, but was waived actually by every previous president since. He justified his decision as being, quote, in the best interest of the United States and the pursuit of peace between Israel and the Palestinians, end of quote. And as we all know, the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem was not well received by the Palestinians or by the international community at large. We all remember that on December 21st, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly, 128-9 votes to condemn Trump's decision, with 35 countries abstaining at the time. Palestinian officials reacted promptly, declaring the Oslo Accords dead, the two-state solution demolished, and the U.S. role in the peace process no longer acceptable. The PLO leadership boycotted the U.S. administration and refused to attend the recent White House meeting, actually last week, to solicit donations for the ailing economy in Gaza. For those of us who occasionally deal with the Palestinian leadership, I thought their change of mindset was basically a sea change, was a very kind of sudden and deeply felt change. I mean, when we met with them before, during, let's say, the last visit they made to Washington, they were more enthusiastic about their contacts with the administration. I would even say probably unjustified enthusiasm with regards to their excitement about what is being promised to them. Then suddenly, with the decision made on Jerusalem, they felt quite betrayed and took it quite personal. U.S.-Palestinian relations quickly deteriorated in, as I said, unprecedented manner to the current status of name-calling and trading insults and accusations, including anti-Semitism and so on, at each other. Haaretz described a couple of days ago the relationship as the, quote, the worst ever. The crisis culminated with the signing by President Trump last Friday of the $1.3 trillion omnibus bill, which included the so-called Taylor Force Act that cuts actual aid to the Palestinian Authority this time, until the Palestinian Authority stops paying social welfare subsidies for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails and for the families of fallen fighters fighting Israel. More importantly, I would say, than the official position of whether PLO or PA leaders, public opinion in Palestine has been very interesting. I looked at the most recent survey done in Palestine, and it shows that a majority of Palestinians, 88%, polled by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey, PSR, earlier this month. Actually, the survey was conducted between the 14th and the 17th of this month, March. viewed the American role in the peace process as biased in favor of Israel, and 51% urged rejection of the American deal of the century, the so-called deal of the century. And if and when, particularly this deal is unveiled, because with all due respect, the deal has been threatened for a long time, and we haven't seen it yet officially. So in addition, a majority of 65% opposed the resumption of Palestinian contacts with the Trump administration. So it's not just the leadership, which kind of is probably the late newcomer to this type of reaction. I think the Palestinian public has been way ahead of its leadership in this regard. 68% in this survey urged the PA leadership not to return to negotiations with Israel, even if the US asks them to do so. On Jerusalem, a whopping 94% said that they were opposed to making Abu Dis suburb as the capital of the Palestinian state. 86% were opposed to the idea of expanding the Gaza Strip to include parts of Sinai in return for Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank. 52% of Palestinians considered the US decision to suspend support for UNRWA as an explicit attempt to deny Palestinian refugee rights and drop the refugee issue from the political agenda of its proposed negotiations. What are the regional and international implications of these changes in US policy, particularly toward or starting with the issue of Jerusalem? How does this shift affect US interests in the region, specifically its self-proclaimed traditional role in mediating the Arab-Israeli conflict? Is this a paradigm or a permanent shift in US foreign policy toward the conflict, or is it reversible in the future as implied by the wishful thinking of some of the Palestinian leaders? What are the options left for the Palestinians in light of this change? And finally, what role can the international community play given the new American position? To discuss these issues and answer some of these questions, we have assembled a very distinguished panel for you today, and they will be speaking about 12 to 15 minutes each, to be followed by a Q&A. Cards are placed on your seats. If you don't mind, if you have a comment or a question, please identify yourself, your affiliation, and write your question. When you're ready, raise your hand. Your card will be picked up by the staff, and I'll be more than delighted to read your questions or comments during the Q&A. The order will be, as the speakers are seated, they will speak from their seats, going from right to left. Shibley Telhami will talk about the regional and international implications of these changes that I just described. William Quandt will put that in the perspective of the history of peacemaking in the Middle East. John Quigley will talk about the legal implications of these decisions. And Yousef Munayyer will talk about the kind of Palestinian perspective and internal implications of this. We're grateful for all four distinguished speakers for being here today. And thank you all for, again, being here. And let's go ahead first with Shibley, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Khalil, for hosting us. And it's a pleasure to be with old friends on this panel. I'm going to start by just saying a couple of things about Jerusalem, and then I want to frame the picture strategically as I read it right now. What I want to say about Jerusalem is Bill next to me, Bill and I are co-authors of a book with three others, The Peace Puzzle, about American diplomacy toward the Arab-Israeli issue from 1989 to 2012, I think, or something like that. We have a chapter on the Camp David negotiations in 2000. And one of the conclusions, one of the key conclusions in that chapter is the principal reason for the failure of the negotiations was the issue of Jerusalem. And that is the issue that brought down the negotiations. In some ways, the Israelis and the Americans went into the negotiations thinking that Jerusalem is a negotiable issue for the Palestinians, despite the fact that warnings, including public ones that some of us have made. Nonetheless, that's what brought down the negotiations. So Jerusalem historically has been far more important for the Palestinians and certainly broadly Arabs than people assume. The question is whether things have changed dramatically since. That's really the big issue. And so I'd like to do a little bit of a broad analysis of where things are strategically on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and take that picture at a macro level, Trump aside. I know we're all obsessed with Trump. It's obviously a huge factor. It's hard not to be obsessed with Trump. And everything that happens every single day or every single hour. I'm sure we missed something already by being here talking about this issue. But the reality of it is, let's put it aside, and there is a big picture out there that, in fact, tells us a lot in and of itself without Trump. The big picture, let's start with the Arab picture. That is, the Palestine question today is not a priority issue for any of the Arab governments. And all the Arab governments are strategically vulnerable, regionally and domestically. And thus, this issue is even less important to them than it has been historically, to the point that there are pressing priorities that trump this issue day in and day out. And we see that both in terms of the Iran issue for the Gulf states, the domestic stability issue for a lot of them, the fighting is Islamist militancy in some cases, political Islam broadly, and the regional conflict, even among themselves, as is the case with Qatar and its the states that are boycotting it. So, so we have clear priorities that don't weigh in on behalf of the Palestinians that typically provided strategic depth for the Palestinians. In fact, if you want to really internalize that, just think for a moment about why Trump said this is a good moment to do Arab-Israeli peace, and why he thought that the brilliant idea of doing a regional approach rather than a bilateral approach to Israel and the Palestinians was a good one. In a way, why buying into the Arab peace plan seemingly seemed like a very good idea embraced by the Israelis early on. Because when the Arab peace plan was put on the table by then Crown Prince Abdullah, it was really seen that Arabs could weigh in, would give incentives to Israel to make compromises because the Palestinians themselves could not provide enough incentives. So they weigh in on behalf of the Palestinians. Now the picture is that at least in the Trump administration, among Israelis, among many analysts, is that the Arabs so desperately need the U.S., in some ways a relationship with Israel, that they're willing to put pressure on the Palestinians instead of putting pressure on the Israelis. So you've got a completely different, now this is, of course, you can argue this is not exactly right, but nonetheless, that is the assumption, and there's some truth to it because of the shifting Arab priorities. Second, beyond the Arab picture, if you look at the distribution of power on the ground, the Palestinians versus the Israelis. The Palestinians have not, if anything, the inequality has grown in the sense that Israel, the main restraint on Israeli behavior in the West Bank now is Israeli interest, not what the Palestinians necessarily can do on the ground. And so in that sense, there is an incredible asymmetry of power, with Palestinians having very little leverage on their own, and that is, of course, exacerbated by the Palestinian internal divide and by the paralysis, strategic paralysis in the vision, because it's a catch-22. If the Palestinians commence violence of any kind, they really stand to lose a lot, not only stand to lose public opinion, but the asymmetry of power means that they could lose a lot more than the Israelis will lose if they were to employ that as a strategic option, which is what I think is keeping that from happening. And at the same time, what else is there to put pressure? And people talk about peaceful means that have been tried. Yes, it can make some difference, but there's no evidence that could transform. And so the strategic paralysis in that picture also makes the Palestinians weaker. This is all independent from Donald Trump. Let's keep that in mind. This is not a function of Donald Trump. Third, to the extent that the Israelis have the upper hand, by far, you have an Israeli government whose ministers don't even want to see a Palestinian state. And many of the ministers believe that it is the right to occupy, and it's not even an occupation. So whatever the purpose of any negotiation, that's not even acknowledged by a large number of people who make up the Israeli government, whatever the official position is. And they're the ones who have the constituency that supports it. So in that sense, it is hard to envision what is then working in favor of some agreement along the lines that is perceived to be a two-state solution. Fourth, even separate from the Arab government positions, meaning that they have strategic priorities that motivate them and subordinate the Palestine question, in general, there was a reservoir of support for the Palestinians among the Arab publics. I think there still is, although it's declined. You don't blame Syrians to be focused on their own troubles at home. You don't blame Libyans for being focused on their own troubles at home, or Yemenis. Everybody has their own troubles that are incredibly pressing and tragic and humanitarian crisis. And so even the public is distracted. But still the issue resonates. But here's the thing, that governments now not only have their own priorities that subordinate the question of Palestine, but they have every incentive to deprive the public of championing the question of Palestine because they see that as a threat to them in ways they hadn't seen that in the past. In the past, they were able to use the public obsession with Palestine as a distraction. Now it works against them because people will use it as a wedge against the governments because they can't confront the governments directly. And therefore, they have every incentive, particularly in the media war, to diminish the issue of Palestine among the public. And so there's a war, and in some ways, it's not a shocker that a lot of the people who are championing the question of Palestine more outspokenly are Islamic groups that have, or of course, are at war with the governments. And that makes it even harder for the governments to jump on the bandwagon of that issue. There's a war of ideas, and because the Palestine question is part of that war of ideas, it is on the losing side with in terms of the paradigm that our governments want to press. The final point I want to make strategically is that there is even before Trump came to office, and frankly, really for the past decade, not just even before Obama and certainly through the Obama years, there has been a huge discomfort with the conclusion that the two-state solution is still viable. That whole idea, which is, of course, the basic notion for negotiation, that's what we're talking about. What is the prospect that we could reach a deal? It's all about that. It's been under assault from right and left. From the left, it said it's too late. There should be one state. It should be equal citizens. It should be egalitarian. And really, no one can see how the Israelis are going to agree to dismantling the settlements and accept the two-state, and it's too late for that anyway. You've heard that from the left. Now on the right, of course, you hear the same exact thing. I mean, if you even listen to Bolton or people on the right, says it's not realistic. You know, we're taking it off the table because people think it's still possible. It's no longer possible. So therefore, you know, let's stick with reality. Of course, they're not calling for egalitarian state. They're calling for Israeli implementation of Israeli control and maybe inequality or some limited autonomy. But essentially, that whole idea has been under assault. And in fact, what makes it even harder is those people who are sticking to it throughout the period are doing it half-heartedly. And what do I mean by half-heartedly? Almost everyone is unsure whether it's still viable. It's not a conviction that it's still viable. What keeps people tied to it is a fear that the alternatives are much worse. In the American picture, you know, the vast majority of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, independents, when you ask them, if it comes down to it, would you prefer a Jewish state but no equal rights for the Arabs, or would you prefer a democratic state that is no longer Jewish? The majority, the vast majority, every single group say, I would prefer a democratic state that is not Jewish, rather than a Jewish state that's not democratic. Among American politicians, there is no politician who could stand for the idea of Israel as a non-democratic state. And there is no politician who can stand for the idea that Israel is not a Jewish state politically. And so that very idea, if you don't have a two-state, people don't know what to do with it. They have no place to go. It's a comfort zone. It's a place to keep yourself politically. And frankly, even among Israelis and Palestinians, those who kind of still support it in practice, when you ask them, what happens if there's no two-state solution, what you get is not people saying a one-state solution with equal citizenship. The vast majority of people think there would be conflict for years to come. And so they think the alternative is even worse. And with that alternative being worse, they prefer this one. So let me end with the following. One is that before I come to Trump for one final word, I remind you of 8 years of Barack Obama. I advised that administration on this issue. I respect the President Obama, but let's face it. Here is a president who was in principle egalitarian, wanted to do the right thing on this issue, and had failed, even though his constituency, the Democrats, actually supported him doing something. And he failed. And in fact, you can argue that the Obama administration wasted the lost final opportunity that there may have been there for the two-state solution, because the fact that he couldn't do it and took 8 years, in the meanwhile, a lot of the things changed on the ground, it made it impossible. But even Obama, who wanted to do it, an environment that was different, did not do it. Frankly, didn't move the needle at all on this issue. And so let's be realistic about Trump. So Trump comes in, yes, of course, and Trump has a different agenda, a different constituency. America is divided. He is dealing with catering to his base, and we know where his base is. In my own polling of American public opinion, of course, we know that there's a deep divide, but that divide has gotten deeper on this issue, where Democrats overwhelmingly want the U.S. to be even-handed, and a majority of Republicans want the U.S. to be decidedly on Israel's side of the equation. So when you look at that picture, of course, his constituency is in one place on this particular issue. And he takes the step that he does, and Bolton aside, and everyone else aside, clearly he is doing very much, his plan is very much in harmony with what the Israeli government would like to do to solve its own problem. And obviously, there is a thought that Arab governments could be brought on board because they need the U.S. for strategic reasons on Iran and other issues. But even with that, as I wrote on the eve of his decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, it was very peculiar that a president who says he wants to make the deal of the century hadn't put the ideas on the table yet, and he moves the embassy before that altogether. and to undermine his hand. And that led me to the conclusion that either his advisors are living in a bubble, and I think they are up to a point, or that they had already given up on this, on the idea of the deal of the century, and they're just looking for an excuse to blame someone else. That might be the real thing. The one thing I want to say, just to conclude on the Trump plan, particularly what we know of the Trump plan, which is supposedly ideas that don't have any frame of reference, with no reference to previous negotiations, with no reference to previous UN resolutions, regardless of the content of the plan, it puts the Palestinians in an almost impossible position to accept it, even separate from Jerusalem. And the reason for it is to the extent that the Palestinian Authority, particularly Mahmoud Abbas as president of the Palestinian Authority, the main thing that they've been able to do, if you want to see any success in their diplomacy over the years, has been to keep alive the power of the international resolutions as the only lever the Palestinians still have in the negotiation, the frame of reference. And obviously, the last resolution at the UN in the Obama administration declaring settlements illegal, that clearly was it. So if the Palestinians engage in the current plan that is being talked about, even to engage with the idea that there's no longer a frame of reference, it is a precedent that undermines everything that they've accomplished. And that's why I think they feel it's really impossible for them to go back to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Shibley. Dr. Quandt, the floor is yours, please.
Well, Shibley has cheered us up a lot, as I expected. And unfortunately, I really don't have too much to add. He's covered so many of the issues and given us very little reason to think that there are real good alternatives. And I think he's right that Trump is not entirely responsible for the sense of gloom that pervades sessions like this, but he is certainly adding to it. I guess in the few minutes that I want to take, I'll just reflect on the U.S. role over the years more generally and how we've almost always been running a little bit behind reality, because American policy typically has been made against the background of constructs that come into being at a certain time and then endure for a while until they are manifestly proven to be wrong. So for a long time, I'm not going to do a detailed history of how we got to where we are today, but I think it's clear that from the beginnings of the modern phase of this conflict after Israel was created as a state, the prevailing American hope was the Palestinian issue as a kind of refugee issue and as a humanitarian issue would fade away as a new stability took hold, and that the states where Palestinians had ended up would eventually absorb them. This was called in the 1950s the icebox strategy. Just freeze the conflict and eventually Palestinians will grow up as Jordanians or grow up as Syrians and the Palestinian issue will fade away. Well, that obviously didn't happen, and it took quite a long time. And during this period, of course, people looked toward Jordan as the main state that would speak on behalf of Palestinians because it had such a large number of them, and people tended to like King Hussein. He was easy to deal with. So this was the kind of attitude that prevailed really for a very, very long time. It was only after the 1967 war and the emergence of the PLO that you began to get a slight revision of this kind of Jordan-centric, state-centric view, and people started talking about the Palestinian issue as not just refugees, but also a political issue. So you went through these kind of anguishing periods of a Palestinian entity of some sort might be possible, or a confederation with Jordan. And I'm old enough to have gone through that debate of the 1970s and was one of the early supporters of a Palestinian state, not just an entity, but an actual state in West Bank and Gaza. I guess we would call that the two-state solution now. And I find it difficult, having been an early supporter of that, to admit that I no longer think it's possible. And I want to tell you when I think these moments came where it ceased to be realistic. Maybe it never was, but certainly more obvious today. So I was in two administrations, one which was quite Jordan-centric, Nixon-Kissinger. I have to apologize for that in advance, but I was a minor figure in that administration. And they really didn't take the Palestinian issue seriously. They knew there was an issue, but they didn't want to deal with it. They kept thinking that the states were the big players, and you deal with Egypt, you deal with Syria, eventually you get around to dealing with Jordan, and that's about as far as you can go on dealing with the Palestine issue as part of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Jimmy Carter, for whom I also worked, did have a different attitude. He, pretty much on his own, and I'm still not quite sure why, introduced very early in his administration the idea of a Palestinian homeland. And he added to that, said, for people who have suffered for so long. So Carter, on some level, had picked up the idea that this wasn't just a refugee problem. There was a political dimension to it that needed to be addressed. And I spent 2.5 years working with him, trying to figure out what he really thought. Did he really think that a Palestinian state or Jordanian-Palestinian Confederation or what was possible? And I still am not entirely sure of the answer. But among the presidents that we've had, he at least had invested some time and energy in trying to understand it. And we've seen, as in his post-presidency, he's actually continued to be interested in it. He still speaks out on it. And he is, I think, much more informed on the issues. He's actually met with Palestinian leaders regularly. He's probably the only president who has, not just as a matter of being on the job, taken the issue seriously, but has continued to think about it as a human rights issue and as a strategic issue for the region. However, after the kind of limited start of getting some recognition that the Palestinian issue needed distinctive treatment as a political issue in the 1970s, I think the 1980s, up until the very end of the Reagan administration, was really a return to the Jordan option. Reagan's so-called plan of 1982 was Jordan-centric. In fact, it specifically said, we will not support an independent Palestinian state. And yet it was the Reagan administration that at the very end did recognize the PLO in return for the PLO recognizing UN Resolution 242 as a right to exist and renunciation of terrorism. So we enter the 1990s with a much clearer recognition that the PLO as a player has to be in the game. Bush administration accepts that somewhat reluctantly, especially after the Gulf War. They weren't very happy with Arafat, but we end up seeing that the PLO and the idea of a two-state solution is the dominant paradigm of the 1990s. And if there was a time when a two-state solution could have been achieved, I think it would have been in that period of the 1990s. You had a brief moment when Rabin was prime minister, Arafat was still had sufficient legitimacy as Palestinian leader, and the Americans had overcome their allergy to dealing with the PLO, and the Arab states were by and large supportive of, let's get this conflict resolved. Now, Rabin is an interesting character on this because he was very against dealing with the Palestinian issue early on. But his attitude toward the West Bank and Gaza, I remember when he came to see Carter for the one and only time, Carter really interrogated him on, what do you plan to do with the West Bank? What's your view? And he said, the only thing we care about in the West Bank is security, and that does not require Israeli sovereignty. It simply requires that we know that no Arab army will ever be able to invade us from the West Bank. That's what I care about. And I remember listening to that and thinking, if he really means that, there's the possibility of a deal, either with Jordan or with the Palestinians, if he really doesn't claim sovereignty. Well, that changed about 2 months after Rabin said that to us, because Menachem Begin was elected from the Likud party, and it was clear from almost day one that Israeli policy was no longer, as long as Likud was in charge, going to willingly give up anything on the West Bank. That the attitude that Begin had, and I think it's still Netanyahu's attitude, is that this is legitimate as much Israel as any other part of Eretz Israel. And if we start giving away any part of Judea and Samaria, we may as well give up Tel Aviv as well. There's no fundamental difference. And that was a real mindset change. Rabin did not think that way. He was willing to, at least he seemed to be willing to compromise, but Begin was not. And I think it's been hard for mainstream Americans to understand what a dramatic change that was and how paralyzing it was for American presidents, because we couldn't figure out how to get people like Begin or Netanyahu or Shamir back to this Rabin-like position of willingness to cede the West Bank in return for peace. In other words, the model that had worked with Egypt, land for peace, and could have worked between Syria and Israel, land for peace, was no longer on the table with Likud governments. And I think that has been true every time there's been a Likud government. So Clinton and maybe had this brief moment, the beginning of the 1990s and perhaps briefly at the end, when a two-state solution of some sort might have been constructed and might have been accepted, but it failed. And I think that particular failure, the Clinton failure, was the last moment when it was really worth thinking that this two-state alternative was on the table. Certainly during most of the Bush period, insofar as there was any interest in a two-state outcome, it was largely Israelis and Palestinians on their own who were trying to see if it was still viable, and it proved not to be possible to reach an agreement. And then, as Shibley said, when Obama came in, I think he understood that it was worth a try. And remember, at the very beginning of his presidency, you had Tzipi Livni and Olmert, who did seem to be willing to make some kind of concessions. But almost immediately, Netanyahu came back. And I think after a few experiences of confronting Netanyahu, Barack Obama, who was, after all, a politician, realized that Netanyahu had more support in Washington in crucial places, namely Congress, than he did, than he, Barack Obama. Just remember when Netanyahu came and spoke to a joint session of Congress, he got something like 30 standing ovations. Barack Obama would not have gotten 30 standing ovations. And he knew it. And I think at that point, he just decided that, I'll let my secretaries of state play with the issue, but I'm not going to invest any more of my limited political capital on this issue. There are other issues that I need to pay attention to, and too bad, I would have liked to have done it, but I can't. And I think that was the last even intellectual moment when a president thought this is an important issue. Bush, the current administration talks about the deal of the century. This is totally phony. It's the real estate agent telling us there's a great deal out there for you, and all you have to do is sign up for it, and it'll be the biggest tower, and it'll cost the most money, and it'll be terrific. This is not serious diplomacy. Serious diplomacy is actually quite hard. It requires that you know the issues in some detail, and you be prepared to put in a lot of time and effort and use your political capital to get somewhere with it. And that is not at all the attitude of this administration. This is an administration that thinks if you're going to get anywhere, you make a deal with the Saudis who have lots of money, and the Saudis will go to the Palestinians and say, you don't have any choice, you've got to do what the Americans and the Israelis want, and we'll make it worth your while by dropping a few $1 billion on you. Unless I'm totally out of touch, this is crazy. It's not going to work. If it does work, I'm going to just get out of this business entirely because it'll mean I don't understand it at all. But I think that is the mindset. This is a transaction. You just have to find the selling price. And if the Saudis are prepared to finance it, how can somebody said this to me the other night. He said, how can the Palestinians say no to the Saudis if the Saudis come to them and say, you've got to do this because the Americans and the Israelis want you to? And I think one thing the Palestinians are good at is saying no. And maybe that's not true any longer, but I think they're very good at saying no. So I think we're stuck with an American policy that leads nowhere. And when it fails, there's no fallback. It's just, we're going to hear that we tried and it failed and it's their fault, and the they is going to be the Palestinians. The emphasis will then shift toward other issues in the Middle East. I'm afraid it's going to be Iran and the threat from Iran, and that's going to be fed by a number of regimes who want us to focus on that. And so for the near term, and for as far as I can see ahead, I don't really see that there's going to be any real diplomacy on Israel-Palestine. There may be an announcement one of these days about some kind of a proposal, but it's not going to go anywhere. And there, as I say, there's no plan B. So if there is hope for the future, forget about the United States for a while. We're not going to be the actor that opens any doors on this. If it's going to happen, it's going to come from a new generation of Israelis who say to themselves, my God, what have we gotten ourselves into? We really are going somewhere that we don't want to go. And Palestinians who also say there are other ways of approaching this conflict. We need to think about not one state, two states. We need to think about new definitions of coexistence and separation, of sovereignty and mixed sovereignty, and concepts that we're not very comfortable with because they don't fit this kind of state-centered way of thinking. And it may take a very long time before any of us can think through how would that apply to a very complicated, tiny little piece of geography where two peoples have conflicting claims, but they're both there and neither is going to go away. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Bill. Now we move to the legal implications of the crisis. Professor John Quigley.
Thank you, Khalil. I don't know if I can inject a note of optimism, but I'll make an effort at doing so. The international community has remained quite strong on the issue of Jerusalem. I want to focus on Jerusalem primarily here, in not considering that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. And that is reflected, of course, in the fact that states that do have diplomatic relations with Israel have kept their embassies in Tel Aviv, and they have not moved them to Jerusalem, despite the entreaties of the government of Israel going back to about 1951 or 1952. The other is on an issue that may not seem all that key, but has been the subject of congressional legislation, and that is the question of the issuance of passports to a person born in Jerusalem, specifically West Jerusalem. And what if that person or that person's parents, when that person applies for a U.S. passport, wants the blank on the passport that says place of birth to be listed as Israel? And countries, by and large, have the issue hasn't come up in many countries, but where it has, they have been quite firm in refusing to indicate Israel as the place of birth of a person born even in West Jerusalem, which has been the situation in the cases that have arisen. You may be aware that there was a case on this that went to the United States Supreme Court several years ago, because the State Department refused to implement the Act of Congress of 2002 that required the president to to use Israel as the place of birth in these situations. And since 2002, presidents, even up to the present time, have not changed the policy on the rationale that to do so would be an acceptance by the United States that Jerusalem, even West Jerusalem, is under the sovereignty of Israel. A case went to the Supreme Court of Canada on this a few years ago, actually, where the initial lower court had refused the request of a young person who was born in West Jerusalem, but who was a Canadian citizen, applied for a Canadian passport and demanded to have Israel listed, and the Canadian government refused. The Canadian Arab Association actually became involved in that case as an intervener, which is a procedure that they have in the Canadian courts. And the Canadian Arab Association asked me to be an expert witness in the case. And so we went through a whole discussion in the Federal Court of Canada on the issue, and the court eventually decided that the Canadian government's position, namely that the status of Jerusalem is undetermined, would prevail, and that there was no right on the part of the individual to have Israel listed as the place of birth. So you've got those two issues. But I would like to go back a bit to see how this issue has played out in the international community, because from the time of the partition resolution, it has been accepted that an Israeli assertion of control over Jerusalem and making it its capital really precludes any successful accommodation and resolution of the Palestine question. And this came up, first of all, when Israel applied for membership in the United Nations in 1949. In order to be a member of the United Nations, a state has to be peace-loving. And when Israel made its application, there were severe questions raised as to whether Israel was a peace-loving state, primarily on two issues. One, the refusal to repatriate the Palestinians who had been displaced. And two, the question of Jerusalem, because the partition resolution called for it to be administered separately from either an Israeli or a Palestinian state. And so Abba Eban was the diplomat who was in charge of the Israeli move for membership in the UN. And he was questioned on both of these issues very severely. And on the repatriation issue, he managed to be ambiguous and not to say that Israel would commit to repatriation. He said that it was a domestic issue for Israel to decide. On the Jerusalem issue, however, he acknowledged that it was not something that was a domestic issue that Israel could decide. When he was questioned, he said the question of sovereignty over Jerusalem has not been settled, and that Israel would have its proposals on that, and would suggest that at least the western part be incorporated into the state of Israel. But he acknowledged that that would be something to be dealt with by the United Nations. He was asked whether, if Israel were admitted to membership, it would cooperate with the General Assembly in settling the question of Jerusalem, or whether Israel considered it to be a domestic issue. And he said we would not consider it to be a domestic issue. That was May of 1949 in the ad hoc political committee of the General Assembly, which was the committee that was dealing with the application of Israel. A few months later, David Ben Gurion, speaking in the Knesset in December of 1949, said that and this is a quote, that Jewish Jerusalem is an organic and inseparable part of the state of Israel. It is inconceivable that the United Nations should attempt to sever Jerusalem from the state of Israel or to infringe the sovereignty of Israel over its eternal capital. So that was just 6 months later, where Ben Gurion is renouncing the commitment that had been made by Abba Eban when Abba Eban was trying to placate the international community in order to gain Israel's admission to the United Nations. In 1953, the Foreign Ministry of Israel moved its offices to Jerusalem. The United States made a strong statement denouncing that move, and foreign governments refused to move their own establishments. That is, those governments that did have diplomatic relations with Israel, which at the time wasn't all that many, but they did not move their own establishments into Jerusalem, which would have been normal. Normally, you like to have your embassies in the place where the foreign ministry is, but other governments declined to do that. Then in 1967, Israel managed to gain control over the eastern part of Jerusalem, having invaded Egypt, which brought Jordan in on Egypt's side in lawful self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, which makes Israel's military move into Jerusalem unlawful as aggression under international law. And Israel took over that sector, and that led to additional questions about Israel's long-term intentions. The cabinet of Israel apparently was rather intent from the outset on ensuring that the control of East Jerusalem would be permanent. And Abba Eban, as by then foreign minister, actually tried to get the cabinet to not immediately to say anything that would indicate its control, but the cabinet did so anyway. At the end of June 1967, it adopted a regulation imposing Israeli law on the eastern part of Jerusalem, which is a violation of the idea of belligerent occupation. And that was then denounced by the General Assembly of the UN. And Abba Eban said in the General Assembly, this is only an administrative matter. We're really not asserting sovereignty over East Jerusalem. But that didn't convince the General Assembly. And then, of course, in 1980, the Knesset adopted what it called the Basic Law on Jerusalem, in which it said that Jerusalem, in its entirety, was the eternal capital of Israel. Then in East Jerusalem, the effort has been made very strongly to reduce the population of Arabs. And this has gone largely under the international radar screen, but the government of Israel does not consider Arab inhabitants of East Jerusalem to have the kind of right that one has when one is a citizen of a country. They consider them to be residents, quote unquote, and that residency can be forfeited, in particular by a period of absence from Jerusalem if the person goes abroad for working, for study, and then comes back. The residency status is considered to be defeasible by the government of Israel. And first they said the rationale was that the person had changed their basic, place of connection in the world if they lived somewhere else for a period of time. Then the argument changed a bit, And in more recent times, the claim has been by Israel that the person needs to have loyalty to Israel in order to maintain residency. And this was dealt with in a case that went to the Supreme Court of Israel just last year. And the Supreme Court of Israel said, well, that's not really something you can do. You can't require these people to be to be loyal to Israel, and certainly under the law of belligerent occupation, the occupant can't require the inhabitants to be loyal to the occupant. But the Supreme Court of Israel delayed the implementation of its ruling, it said, in order to give the Knesset time to deal with the matter, because under the law of Israel, you have the concept of parliamentary supremacy, and that is that the parliament has the last word on any issues of rights. So the Supreme Court of Israel said, we'll delay implementation. The Knesset then accommodated by passing a law saying that residency could be lost if there were if the person did not have loyalty to Israel. And that's the present state of the law in Jerusalem. We have with us Dr. Khattab who practices law in Jerusalem and deals with this issue on a daily basis and knows the details of it much more than I do. But the effort has been to deprive Jerusalem of its inhabitants. I mean, and that goes back actually to 1947. There was a meeting of the leadership of the Jewish Agency, December 31, 1947, where they decided on a plan to denude the city of Jerusalem of its Arab inhabitants. That was implemented by military means through the Haganah over the months of January, February, and March of 1948. So this recent effort with respect to East Jerusalem is a continuation of the effort to make the city Jewish, which is why Ben Gurion would call West Jerusalem, Jewish Jerusalem, in 1947, 1948. It became Jewish Jerusalem because the Palestinians were forced out. But I had promised I would start on an optimistic note, and I'm afraid I have not finished in that light, but so be it.
Thank you, John. And now our good friend, Yousef Munayyer, is going to put everything in a very cheerful. Yousef, the microphone is yours, sir.
I think it's important to think a little bit about to think about the moment that we're in right now from a Palestinian perspective as far as their relationship with the Trump administration. It's useful to think a little bit about how that relationship with the Trump administration began and how we got to the point that we are at today, the very low point that we are today in relations between the Palestinian leadership and the Trump administration after all of these policy changes. At the beginning of the relationship, there was something of a honeymoon period. And there was, from the Palestinian end, as there would be from the end of any other player internationally, a desire to attempt to have good relations with the White House and the President of the United States for the same reasons that you would want to have good relations with the President of the United States if you're any other country. This is the most powerful player in the world. And also, of course, the Palestinians had been heavily invested in their relationship with Washington over the years. And we started to see that honeymoon period play out over the first several months of the Trump administration, despite everything that we knew about President Trump, what he said as a candidate, what he said as president-elect, the positions that he took on the UN Security Council resolution, and so on. There was a lot of very well choreographed performances to suggest that the Palestinians wanted to try to make this relationship with Washington work. And from Washington's end, there was also some suggestions that there was a desire to attempt to make it work, despite all of the very clear differences that existed as well. When President Trump went to the region in May of 2017, he met with Mahmoud Abbas, and he also spoke at a meeting in front of Israeli government officials and said President Abbas is serious about peace, and there are going to be some difficult decisions that the Israelis are going to have to make too. What began to happen after that were a number of changes, not just in the sort of Palestinian-American relationship, but in what we began to see happening in the region. And the reason that is particularly important as it relates to Palestinian-American relations, especially with this White House, is from the very outset, this White House has made clear that they are looking at an Israeli-Palestinian peace, a so-called ultimate deal, deal of the century, whatever you prefer, to include a big regional deal as well. And that was something that President Trump made clear, I think for the first time in his meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu in February of 2017, one of the first foreign leaders that he welcomed into the White House after the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, saying that we have an opportunity here to do something really big. And so from the Palestinian perspective, you're taking special note of what the White House relations are like with other players in the region that are going to be instrumental in this deal. And so as we moved into the summer of 2017, we began to see real changes in U.S. policy that I think surprised a lot of people, not just because of what the American position was, but how dysfunctional the American pronouncements of their positions were, specifically towards the dispute between the players in the Gulf. And so from the Palestinian perspective, you are watching the State Department say one thing and the White House say another thing. And the players involved here are also involved in the negotiation of the Israeli-Palestinian issue from the American side. And that includes President Trump's main envoy to the Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking process, Jared Kushner, as well. And so you're watching these things very carefully if you're the Palestinians, trying to understand who are the power players, where are the decisions really being made, what does this mean for how we can approach and understand the Trump administration moving forward. And despite what I would say was a very turbulent summer in the U.S. relationship with Qatar in particular and with that entire situation, the relationship with the Palestinians still seemed to be largely intact going into the fall, when you had what was, again, a very good-looking meeting between President Abbas and President Trump at the United Nations General Assembly. Again, repeated comments about the desire of both parties to make peace, the importance of it. You know, President Trump, Abbas said, we have great faith in you to make the deal of the century, and so on. Everything was, at least, superficially, still optimistic. Then in the fall, we started to see things start to deteriorate pretty rapidly. This included the growing movement of the Taylor Force Act in Congress. We also started to hear reports about the possibility of the General Delegation Office for the PLO in Washington being closed by the State Department. And then we saw a very dramatic set of events in Saudi Arabia in November that made clear that there was significant American input into changes that were taking place in Saudi Arabia that could have major ramifications on the region and the region's future. And of course, that was followed very shortly after by the Trump declaration on Jerusalem, which of course was not just the end of the honeymoon period, but really represented a collapse of the relationship, bringing us to the low that we are at today. And what we saw that followed that, and it really crystallized what was what has come to be the American strategy under Trump, which is a pressure strategy on the Palestinians, is what I would characterize as a three-pronged attack on the pillars of U.S. Middle East policy that we have known to this date. And these were an American attack on three sort of central components of the process. One was on the notion that the Palestinian state is the desired outcome of this process. And that was something that was true from the very beginning of the Trump administration. They wouldn't utter the words two-state solution. And so that was taken off the table. With the Trump declaration on Jerusalem, Jerusalem was, in the words of the President of the United States, taken off the table. And this, of course, is a reversal of longstanding U.S. policy, not just on the issue of Jerusalem, but on the issue of American neutrality on Jerusalem as a foundational element of the modern-day peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians, a guarantee that was laid out in letters given to the parties prior to the Madrid conference. And, of course, then you had the attack on UNRWA as well, which represented what I see as an attack also on the question of Palestinian refugees and the salience of that question in any resolution, which is something that previously the United States, while they may have had their private positions on, had never enunciated a position on and never suggested a position on so significantly as to attack UNRWA in the way that they did, and in doing so attack the Palestinian refugee question as well. What this makes clear is that the Trump administration has adopted wholeheartedly a strategy that many in this town had advocated for some time, and that's this notion that the reason that the peace process has not been successful to date is because the Palestinians, the party under foreign military occupation, not the Israelis, are the party that needs to be pressured more. And if you pressure the Palestinians more, then eventually there will be submission and acquiescence to the Israeli demands that will make negotiations result in some kind of agreement. And here I wholeheartedly agree with Bill in saying that Palestinians are very good at saying no to things like this, as I think they should. But this is what's become the Trump administration policy now. And I think we see that now with the passage of the Taylor Force Act as well, leading to an even greater tightening of the screws on the Palestinians. Domestically, the Palestinians now are looking at ways in which they could try to respond, obviously internationally. There is not a great deal of traction that they have. This is a very different international climate than the one that existed during the Obama administration. The opportunities that there are to try to do bilateral engagement to get the sort of recognition of a Palestinian state, which had been the sort of go-to international diplomatic strategy of the PLO previously, does not seem to have as much traction today. And obviously at the United Nations, the United States has been very clear that they are going to be a very strong opponent of anything Palestinian, not just resolutions, but also, as we saw early on in the administration, even individuals who are Palestinian when they rejected the appointment of a Palestinian outright to a position that had nothing to do with Palestine just by virtue of the fact that he was Palestinian. So the options there are also very limited. So this allows for an opportunity to have a domestic focus, and there are also plenty of limitations. There was some traction on the reconciliation front last year, but it was always clear from the outset that neither party was entirely committed or engaged. And in recent weeks, we saw what may very well be the end of that process when there was an incident in Gaza when the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister and the head of Palestinian Authority Intelligence, their convoy in Gaza that was entering Gaza to open up a sewage treatment facility for events around that, was attacked in what appeared to be an assassination attempt. And obviously the Palestinian Authority came out very strong against Hamas and said, you know, they're responsible for security there, we hold them responsible, and so on and so forth. And while it's not really clear who exactly was behind it or what the motive was, and there are a lot of questions around that event, it made the prospects of any reconciliation, which were already slim, even slimmer. So on the Hamas-Fatah front, there doesn't seem to be much moving. There's also a question of what can the Palestinians do to shore up the domestic legitimacy crisis that has existed for a very, very long time. You have a Palestinian leadership which is aging. Mahmoud Abbas now is in his 83rd year. In 2009, I believe it was, there was an emergency session of the Palestinian National Council to elect younger members of the leadership committees in the PLO, that's still not a very young contingent. There is no clear succession plan right now, so there is another meeting on April 30th, which is going to be a full session of the Palestinian National Council, which is the highest body in the PLO, that may be an opportunity to try to address some of this. I think most of the factions outside of the leading factions in the Palestinian Authority have a lot of doubts about the success of that process, but it is an opportunity on the horizon nonetheless, and we shall see what happens after April 30th. There are also events that are going to be taking place starting this week in Gaza that may not be on everybody's radar, but may quickly be put on everybody's radar because of the way that they may spiral out of control. And that is a march that is taking place in the Gaza Strip, what is being called the Great Return March, and is going to start on Land Day, March 30th, and going to feature masses of unarmed Palestinian civilians attempting to repatriate, to return to their homes outside of the Gaza Strip and to the lands from which they and their ancestors became refugees. And that demonstration, which is going to begin on March 30th, is supposed to sustain itself through May 15th, which is another very important day, obviously, in the Palestinian historical narrative. But the reason that this is, of course, so important is because the way in which the Israelis have treated any Palestinian approaches to the fence area, which is with the routine use of lethal force to disperse protesters, including unarmed protesters, of course. So what may take place, in the next coming days, is a demonstration that the Israelis respond to in the ways in which they routinely respond to them, creating a kind of escalation and a crisis that we haven't seen in some time. And so I think that's important to watch, and where that might go is not clear. And as I said, that the plan is for that to sustain until May 15th through encampments that would be set up at the fence there. And on May 15th as well, and I think this underscores sort of the Trump administration's adoption of this strategy. The administration announced that there will be an opening of the embassy in Jerusalem on May 15th. And of course, that's the day that the Israelis celebrate as the founding of the State of Israel. Palestinians obviously have a very different perspective on that day as a day that marks the destruction of their nation as it was, the depopulation of the majority of the native inhabitants of Palestine, and really the beginning of a continued series of dispossessions. And for the United States, I think, to choose this day is really a clear message to Palestinians that the United States intends to add insult to injury. And I think that really marks how low things are today between the Palestinians and the Trump administration. It's hard to remember a time in modern times when it was that bad. And so, if you're the Palestinians, how do you strategize around this? What do what do you look to try to plan for the future? It's very difficult in large part because there are a ton of unknowns everywhere the Palestinians look. When it comes to the United States, in a few weeks they're going to be dealing with their third national security advisor, their second Secretary of State. The Trump administration is very erratic. It is besieged by all kinds of legal troubles. It's unclear how long this administration is going to be around, and if it is around, how much actual political capacity it could devote if it was serious to this issue. Regionally, you also have a number of different unknowns, which we may find out about, in the coming months. And in Israel as well, there's also a lot of there's a lack of clarity as far as what the Israeli government might look like in the months and weeks to come because of all of the scandals surrounding Benjamin Netanyahu and the serious prospect of elections at some point in the future. So I think the one thing that is constant, though, despite all of these unknown variables, is the Israeli position as far as their policy towards the annexation of Palestinian territory and the entrenchment of the occupation. And I think that is something that was underscored very recently by the announcement of the Israeli Transportation Ministry on a new project for many years into the future and for over $1 billion to build a railway station deep into the West Bank, reaching all the way out to a settlement area called Kfar Tapuah, which is just south of the Palestinian city of Nablus, making very clear what Israeli intentions are to continue building in that direction, expanding in that direction for the long term, with no real vision for ending their presence in the West Bank, including very deep into the West Bank. Khalil, I just want to answer one of the questions that you posed at the outset. Are these changes reversible? And I think that, to an extent, there are some things that are reversible. I don't think that the Palestinian-American relationship has to stay this bad, in part because Trump is an outlier period. Not just in American history, but I think as far as, leaders around the world in the Western world are concerned. So I think whatever comes after Trump, there will be a recognition that Palestinian positions toward the United States were largely a function of an erratic moment, an outlier moment in American history that can be reset. The unfortunate reality, though, is that this is a moment that the Israelis are exploiting to create changes that are going to have long-lasting implications, which probably cannot be changed, including exploiting this opportunity to create changes on the ground in the West Bank. And it's very hard to see any American president reverse the decision on Jerusalem now that it has been made. I think the question that the Palestinians have to ask is, how can they look at this unique moment and find ways to capitalize on it themselves to create long-lasting change that builds power in the way that the Israelis have been able to exploit?
Thank you, Yousef. Thank you all panelists for your excellent presentations. We're ready now for the Q&A. session. If you have any questions, please just raise your card for staff to pick your card and bring it up here. First question is from Kimberly Dvorak. If you want to address your question to a specific speaker, do that. If not, we'll address it to the whole panel. The first question is from Kimberly Dvorak. How do the people in Palestine view the uprising in Iran? And if the regime falls, what does that mean for possible statehood for them? Anybody would like to deal with this? Shibley, you want to take a jab at it?
I don't know that we actually have any polls at all on that, so it's a question of speculating. I don't, there's one of the criticism of the Trump administration move, particularly on Jerusalem, is that it plays into the hands of those that the administration want weakened, mostly Iran, Hezbollah, Islamist groups that have championed the issue of Jerusalem. Iran has been, with all the complexity of views that Palestinians have on Iran, or the sectarianism, or the question of Arab-Persian relations, Palestinians took certainly the side of Iraq in the war against Iran, but they also find support for the cause coming from Iran. And you could tell we have lots of indications. For example, despite the sectarianism and the Palestinian feeling on Syria and Lebanon, there's still a lot of Palestinians who watch Al Mayadeen station that comes that is really kind of sympathetic to Hezbollah because it focuses on Palestine. And certainly the issue of Palestine has been captured in many ways by Al-Quds. They have Al-Quds Day, of course, in Iran, that they play the Jerusalem issue. So in some ways, the Jerusalem move has actually played into the hands of Iran and its supporters in the Palestinian areas. But I don't think the Palestinians are particularly watching what's happening so much internally in Iran. That's my impression. I don't have polls on that.
Yeah, Kimberly, if you're interested in pursuing that, check with me afterwards. I think I have a copy of the last public opinion survey that was conducted in Palestine earlier this month. It might have a question or two in Iran. If you're interested, I'll be more than glad to share that with you. Saeed Arakat, Al-Quds. Suppose the Palestinian Authority gives up on the two-state solution and dissolves itself, adopts a one-state agenda. What are the three priorities the Palestinians should undertake to begin the process? This is addressed to John and to Shibley. Should the Palestinian Authority give up on the two states, what priorities should they focus on?
John, you want to take that?
Well, yeah, if it dissolves itself, that puts the onus on Israel to
As occupying power.
as the occupying power to comply with its obligations under the law of belligerent occupation. And of course, it hasn't been very good at complying with the laws of belligerent occupation, particularly with regard to the settlements. If this were done, I mean, one option on the Palestinian side is to be more assertive with the International Criminal Court. Under the statute of the International Criminal Court, there are specific obligations on a belligerent occupant, and specifically the statute of the court, which is the treaty that establishes the court, says that facilitating the transfer of civilians into territory under belligerent occupation is a war crime. So you have a rather what in law we call a slam dunk case against high Israeli officials for war crimes. The Palestine government has in fact presented information already to the court on this, Foreign Minister Malki in particular, and that could be pursued more aggressively. I think that is one of the few levers that the Palestinians have at this point. We talked about the military option before, and this is something that does have the attention of the Israeli government. Now, Mr. Netanyahu, the International Criminal Court may have to fight with the Israeli courts as to who gets to put him in jail, but this would be one possibility.
Yeah, first of all, I don't give anybody advice on what to do, but looking at it analytically, so what's available, to the Palestinians. I think clearly there are two levers that Palestinians have. One is international resolutions and previous agreements that still are important and matter to a large chunk of the international community. They're not a priority. They're not going to maybe move things forward in and of themselves. That's why I think it's risky for the Palestinians to do anything that undermines that, because once you undermine that, you're boxing yourself. And this is a period that you might want to ride if as Yousef said, there is a unique period that everybody's going through right now. Let's survive it, so to speak. Everybody, wants to survive it. So there's that strategy. The other thing is that one reason why things haven't moved beyond this international, kind of sentiment and resolutions is that the Israelis really don't have a unilateral solution. I mean, we're saying the Israelis are going to do this, they're going to do this, but the reality of it is, we just saw the numbers that came out of the Israeli military. There are 6.8 million Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and inside Israel. Arabs, 6.8 million. Jews, 6.5 million. Arabs already outnumber Jews. The self-interest of Israel is clearly a complicated issue here. You can't, even if the people who want to control, can you control indefinitely in this day and age? How long can you go on with that kind of solution? So I think what the Palestinians don't want to do is lose that power of appealing to the large number of Israelis who see a problem with control of Palestinians, to the large number of Americans, even on the right, or American Jews who clearly see a problem with it. So you don't want to do options that undermine that, because in the long term, those remain to be the main source, the primary sources. Whether or not the Palestinians are better off dissolving the authority, and as John said, essentially put all the onus on Israel as an occupying power, because in essence, the authority is already being accused of doing Israel's work and putting the burden on it. That's a complicated story, because I could see pluses and minuses of that, and I'm not sure that it's a very straightforward path here. It's a complicated path.
Yousef?
I would note two things to your initial question. One thing that we've heard Palestinian officials say numerous times, particularly over the last several years, is that number one, the two-state solution is a Palestinian concession, something that Palestinians agree to as a concession, and also that we, the Palestinians, is what they say, will not be the first people to give up on it. We will not be the first party to give up on the two-state solution. Well, when you look at the situation today, it's very clear that the Israelis have given up on it, and it very much seems like Washington has given up on it as well. And so they're really the last player standing. Now, you can argue maybe this is a Trump moment. This doesn't really reflect what U.S. policy will be down the line. Maybe that's not the best policy. But I think there's also an argument to make that Trump or not Trump, the past however many years of U.S. policy have been warning about the demise of this two-state window. And that this is just the inevitable point that we're at right now, where we're in a post-two-state moment, and there has to be a recognition of that. What that looks like where we go is a different story. But I think as far as who's the last to still hold on to it right now, I think it is the Palestinians.
Yousef, you did mention that Israelis have given up on the two-state solution. I don't know if you mean the public or do you mean the government, but the next question is related to that. Greg Aftandilian is asking, what are the chances for the Israeli Labor Party to come back? And if they do, are they just weakened too much to make a difference on this issue?
I would say their chances of coming back into power are extremely slim, barring some really significant changes on the Israeli political scene. It's a numbers game, as it is everywhere, but especially in a parliamentary system like that, you have to get to over half of the parliament. And one of the unique challenges that you have in that system is that you have a block of votes of Palestinian citizens of Israel primarily that are not going to work with any coalition. And so you have, the so-called opposition coalition, which has to try to get to a majority with fewer natural allies available. And so the pathway in recent years to getting to more than 50% is much slimmer for an opposition bloc than it is for a right-wing bloc. The right-wing blocs have more options. They're not going to have a huge majority, but they have more pathways to getting to a majority than the opposition. That being said, there's a real possibility that if Netanyahu exits the scene, having been there for as long as he has been, and having the kind of impact and gravitas in Israeli politics, it's not really clear what happens to a right-wing bloc in his absence, how well it holds together, what sort of infighting between upcoming personalities takes place that would pose challenges to its contiguity. But I still think the chances of labor coming back are very slim.
If I may add,
Sure.
And the question is not just, I agree with what Yousef said about the chance of labor coming back. There are obviously other parties that are slightly to the left of Likud, like Yair Lapid and so forth, who the polls show have a better chance of at least getting more seats and maybe have a chance to form a government. The problem is a little bit deeper than that because there's a societal change taking place. That Israeli society has moved to the right. We have a lot of public opinion polls on that, including even the receptivity of having Arab minority in Israel itself. You look at the Pew poll of last year, which was particularly troubling about the sentiments sharpening. And so there's a deep divide and it's moved to the right. There's demographic shift in Israel and makes it a lot more complicated. But I want to go back with just one more thing in reference to the Palestinian strategy, not only in terms of keeping their lines open, particularly with Israelis who really are struggling, and many of them are, or part of the international community. But one of the failures of the Palestinians is they haven't actually built good relations with the Arab world. They've essentially taken the Arab world for granted. And I think that if you look at the Palestinian Authority, you ask, who's the key ally of the Palestinian Authority in the Arab world right now? I ask anybody to think about who's the key ally. I don't think we know that there is a key ally of the Palestinian Authority in the Arab world. And the same thing with Arab public opinion, taken for granted. You should care about us because we're the Palestinians, and not in a way of showing benefit or displaying empathy and about the things that are going on in the Arab world in the same way. So I think the Palestinians have not played their Arab card very well in recent years. In the past, it was an asset. It's not just that the strategic environment has changed, but there is a Palestinian failure. One of the biggest Palestinian failures, actually, has been to consolidate relations with the Arab world, which had historically been the biggest reservoir of support for the Palestinians.
Shibley, in light of what you just said, we have a related question from Deborah Jahshan, Americans for Peace Now, asking about the extent of the role of public opinion in the Arab world. Does it have really any impact on this massive or whatever collective resignation of Arab governments from the Palestine question, whether it's because of their own agendas or whether because the Palestinians ignore them? Regardless, what role does public opinion have in applying brakes, if you will, to this sellout on the part and does that vary from country to country?
First of all, anyone else, I mean, I know
Yeah.
that that's directed at me, but I think everybody can address that if you want to start. I don't want to
Sure.
monopolize.
Feel free to jump in, everybody. Thank you.
You know, I mean, as Deborah knows, I've written about this quite a bit, you know, throughout my career on the role of public opinion in the Arab world. And we do know, you know, I'm anchored in a realist world in the sense that I understand power and I understand governments dominate. But public opinion is always important. And even in authoritarian leaders, people are very, very afraid of what might happen, both in terms of their legitimacy, but ultimately possible revolutions. And we saw what happened in the Arab uprisings. I happen to think that right now, obviously, public opinion is being repressed. There's no question about it. We're going through a wave in the Arab world, you know, countering the Arab uprisings that were the old sources of power fighting back, and in some ways even the media revolution that we thought is with us just to stay, that came out of the information revolution, the social media, the internet, the satellite television is under assault with a little bit of reversal. But I think it's a temporary issue. When I look at it in historical perspective, the tide is clearly in that direction. There is no way to suppress information. It is expanding. This is a period where you have a short-term fight that's going on in consolidation of power, and it's not going to work to ignore public opinion. It's just not going to work. How long it'll take, I don't know, but it wouldn't take too long. And so in my own opinion, there is no question that public opinion matters. It is the reality, though, is that right now public opinion itself has shifted its priorities for the reasons that I said. I mean, you know, if you consider what the Arab world went through over the past decade, it has been, you know, if you're an Iraqi or you're a Syrian or Yemeni or a Libyan or, you know, who could blame you if you entirely focus on your own life internally? No question that priority will shift over time, but that doesn't mean that Palestine or Jerusalem are no longer important. Saying that they're not a priority in the short term because of ongoing fights doesn't mean that they're not important. Priorities shift, they change. It is still there, and I think that is bound to come back, you know, in before long, because I don't think the strategic path that has been chosen by governments to, in a way, push back can be sustained.
Bill Quandt, is there anybody from your perspective at the White House that seems to understand the Palestine question or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict right now?
No?
No.
No,
All right.
not that I know.
All right. John, there's a question for you from Jonathan Kittab. What are particularly the legal ramifications of a strategy on the part of the Palestinians for massive nonviolent resistance at this time, both in Israel and in the occupied territories? Do you see that as picking up potentially in the midst of this crisis, and what are the legal ramifications?
Yeah, so we've already heard about this march that is planned. The status of an occupied population is something that's rather ambiguous under international law. The occupant is considered to be entitled to maintain order. On the other hand, the population is considered to have a right of resistance against the occupation. And those two concepts are in rather direct conflict with each other. But there is a basis for saying that the occupied population has the right to engage in action, certainly peaceful action, that would be aimed at ending the occupation. You know, how that would play out, you know, may be a different matter, but there is a basis for that position. And it derives from an older concept in the law of warfare that says that if a country is invaded, the population rises up. The term that's used for that is the French term of a lever en masse, a rising of a mass kind. And the idea in the law of war is that if a person engages in that and if they are captured, they would be considered a prisoner of war rather than a criminal. So there is that kind of concept that could be invoked here.
Yousef.
I would say two things. I think the overwhelming majority of Palestinians every single day are engaged in massive nonviolent resistance, living under the occupation, just existing under the occupation. But I think the question is really about organized, massive civil disobedience and demonstrations of nonviolent action that go beyond sort of the passive resistance. And that has happened, right? But it's been primarily led by civil society. And is not something that has been embraced by political leadership, factional leadership. There are obviously some factions that are engaged in and embrace militant options. There are some factions that have preferred the avenue of international diplomatic avenues to try to, advocate in that way. But you haven't seen anybody really, from any of the major factions, embrace a leadership role of these kinds of tactics. Maybe that's something that might change in the future. And I think you can argue, too, that one of the reasons it has grown and has been successful to the extent that it has is because that hasn't been the case. But at some point, I think for it to take the next step, there has to be an engagement from these players in these types of strategies. And with all other avenues closed off, at some point, I think it has to come to that.
Okay, Dalia mentioned the number of unknowns that you referred to, Yousef, and she adds a couple of her own. Is Abbas's health and prospects for a new leadership one of them? What can be expected from a political succession in Palestine? Bill and Yousef?
Well, there will be a succession, I'm sure, but I don't know when and I don't know who it will be. I just don't, I don't have any comparative advantage on that. But I think it's pretty clear that the current leadership is pretty much exhausted. So I'm sure others of you know much more about what who the candidates are. What surprises me is how frequently now the speculation is about who will the Saudis support, who does the UAE support, who does Egypt support, as if that's going to determine how the next leader comes into power. And I guess I, on some deep level, don't believe that's going to happen. I don't think the Saudis, with whatever resources they can mobilize, the UAE with whoever they have on their payroll, can simply parachute somebody in and expect them to have legitimacy. At some point, if it's going to be a leader who has legitimacy, I mean, there is something called an election, which the Palestinians have had, and they've conducted elections that were pretty well organized. So it seems to me that the obvious thing is when Mahmoud Abbas goes, finally, there should be an election, and we don't know who will emerge from that. I think that's why it's interesting. It's not a foregone conclusion, the way when Arafat ran, it was a foregone conclusion he would win. And probably when Mahmoud Abbas was elected, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. This time, I don't think there's an obvious candidate. And that's why it could be interesting. And you could have some real politics taking place. And we might see the emergence of somebody from a new generation who actually managed to touch some of these chords of talking about the conflict a different way, of looking more credible than, these old guys have been around for a long time, and they don't have much to show for what they've done. I don't think it's just going to be the next person is there anybody from the near founders of Fatah that we could kind of prop up? It's just, we're past that point.
Yousef?
Dalia, I would say we've been hearing a lot of reports recently about Abbas's health. There was an instance recently when he was here for a speech at the United Nations Security Council earlier this year, where his itinerary was apparently abruptly changed, and he made a stop at a hospital for what was characterized officially as a routine checkup. And there's also been reports as recently as last week that there's been a doctor, I guess, that has kind of moved into his residence for more direct follow-up. I mean, the reality is nobody really knows what his current health situation is. There's some things we do know. He's, going on 83, and he's, been a pretty regular smoker and overweight for most of his life, and nobody gets younger and outruns biology. It's just, at some point there comes a time, right? So the big question is what comes next, and I think the troubling thing is there's no clear answer. There's not even candidates that are considered viable and have legitimacy among most Palestinians. And so one of the really dangerous, I think, scenarios that happens is, an election. Having an election would be great if there was a stable, political, legitimate body that'd be able to administer it and provide, security throughout that process for it to be free and fair. One of the more dangerous and possibly more likely scenarios is that power struggles emerge between various different leaders of factions and camps that have support from outside players, internal players, and other interests who would, love to produce the next president of Palestine, king of Ramallah, what have you. And that's why I think the next several months are going to be very important if there are opportunities to make a clearer path towards what legitimate representation could look like, or at least some picture of stability. That would be very important.
Okay. That kind of ties a little bit with what Saeed asked earlier, if you don't mind me making a quick comment, guys. In terms of the priorities for the Palestinians at this juncture, I think these types of elections that Yousef just referred to is probably the #1 priority at this time. I think the current crisis is dictating that the Palestinians take over their fate at this time, really. Their future is not in the hands of Israel. It's not in the hands of Trump. It's not in the hands of the United States. Their future is in their own hands. It's in the hands of the Palestinian people. And the sooner they can overcome this leadership crisis, whether it's the aging or the bankruptcy, political bankruptcy, the answer is in the hands of the Palestinians. So I would say that the top priority, back to your question, should be to reorganize their house on a serious basis, taking into consideration the challenges that were mentioned all along. Two, having discussed just this weekend, actually, with several friends in Ramallah about these two issues, the political challenge and the health issue of Abbas, I was assured, again, these are close friends and credible people, that the issue with President Abbas at this time is not health. The issue is he is just so personally frustrated with what he perceives as a personal backstab by Washington. And he is definitely, he's not suffering from anything serious health-wise that's threatening, according to them, but he is definitely losing interest in his day-to-day job based on that. He seems to be very frustrated. He's cut down on his schedule. It's very visible to those who work with him on a day-in, day-out basis that he is, one of them put it, I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't really seek resignation soon. So he's that frustrated with the situation. In terms of the internal, should there be elections, internal options or alternatives? Keep in mind a name that is very, very little known in Washington, that most probably would be the transitional candidates, and that's Mahmoud al-Alul. I think he's the number 2 now in Fatah. He does have enough support, former military commander. He does have enough support internally within Fatah, and most probably he would be the most likely to win should there be a conventional election based on initially Fatah nominating their main favorite candidate and proceeding forward. A couple more questions and we will end with those. What is the likelihood that Egypt will open the Sinai, particularly taking into consideration the humanitarian and financial economic crisis in Gaza, in exchange for the rumored, if you will, aid package that people are talking about here and picking up in Brussels, I guess, next, and Saudi economic incentives. Do you expect Egypt to open up the border with Gaza? Whoever wants to take this one. Shibley?
Let me just give some reflections on this. I certainly go to Egypt frequently, and I talk to people about their strategy. There's no question that Egypt's focus on the Sinai is their internal crisis right now, particularly with the militant groups operating in the Sinai, and that is top priority for them because it's really an issue that is pervasive in the discourse in Egypt, and it has framed everything else they do vis-a-vis Hamas and Gaza. And what's interesting is that people who know about the negotiations with Hamas, in the negotiations with Hamas and over Gaza have been dating back to the Mubarak era, have not been part of the foreign ministry. They were always part of the intelligence services because they were seen. Yes, there was political issue, but it mostly through the security issue and the security coordination dates back, even in the mediation effort between Fatah and Hamas, and the mediation effort to the extent that there were any between Hamas and the Israelis, and the Egyptians played a role. They were handled by the mukhabarat. They were not handled by the foreign ministry. Often the foreign ministry didn't really know exactly what was going on there because they see it as part of the security. Now, that's continuing. That has not really changed. It's still the same kind of priority. What happened was in the past, I think, certainly with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt after the election and the rise of Morsi, Hamas became a domestic political issue in Egypt. It was, part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so in some ways, everything vis-a-vis Gaza was seen through that prism. But because the Sinai crisis became so overwhelming in some ways as a priority issue for Egypt, that it even shifted the Egyptian attitude toward Hamas. And they've shifted they're the ones who ultimately encouraged the recent rapprochement between Hamas and Fatah. And it happened because Egypt, it would not have happened, in my opinion, had the Egyptian priorities not shifted. The big incentive that brought Fatah to the table to negotiate more closely with Hamas was that the Egyptians saw that possibly to their advantage in large part because they wanted coordination from Hamas on the fight against more militant groups in the Sinai that was undermining Egyptian security. That has not changed. And so in my own opinion, the Egyptian calculus in the short term is still focused on figuring out what works in the Sinai from the security perspective. And the issue of Gaza, yes, it's important to them in the long term, and they have to deal with it because it's not going away. But they could push that back. They have the immediate priority is very clear. It's security priority.
Yousef, if you don't mind, respond to that. But if you could also add a little bit to Jihan al-Husseini's question about the relationship Hamas, Dahlan, and its impact on this in Gaza.
Yeah, I kind of had a question based on Shibley's point that I wanted to ask. I guess the Hamas, that sort of anti-Hamas narrative in Egypt was something that was, pushed from the top down in the aftermath of sort of the takeover of, of the Sisi regime from the Muslim Brotherhood government and the effort to kind of, marginalize them and put them aside. Do you think there's a chance that after the election that is taking place and that his, position is more or less solidified beyond, where it's been so far, that maybe the incentives for that narrative start to recede a little bit and that changes?
Well, they have receded a little bit because of their, the kind of changed incentives to deal with Hamas and create this relationship. Khalil mentioned Jahshan. Obviously, Jahshan is still in the background, is very influential. He has very good relations with the Egyptians. And certainly has good relations with the Emiratis, because he's obviously an advisor there. But there's probably a factor there in this rapprochement, because Jahshan, as you know, had been pushed out essentially by Hamas. Clearly has tried to find a way. There's a personal element where the new leader of Hamas after the election was while they're different politically and they were on the wrong side of the equation, they were personal friends in childhood in the same camp. And that personal connection may have been something that also warmed up some, Egyptians in that. So the personal story there is obviously evident, but in the end, it's all about interests. And I think what is driving in Egypt, this is, you look at it in terms of how the regime sees its, its stability. This is one of the huge questions, and everything else is going to be subordinated.
Our time is up. I apologize to the few questions that still we haven't gotten to. And I would like to remind you that our next event is on April 17. The topic is going to be meeting the needs and rehabilitation of the refugees from Syria. And it will be a joint event with the Arab Center Washington, with BCARS, the consortium, the Boston consortium of colleges teaching Middle East studies, Harvard and MIT and so on. So it'll be a worthwhile conference to attend. So please mark it on your calendars, April 17. Thank you again to everybody for being here. Thank you for the panelists for the great presentation.